Okay, this video is actually going to be more of an opinion piece, or at least I guess you could say an observational piece. And I'm desperately hoping that I can tie it all together in a way that it'll make sense because it's a result of kind of an interesting brainstorm that I had, and I'll just start talking on the subject at hand, and we'll just see how it goes. Not too long ago, I was watching just by accident. It is normally not a topic I would actually tune into or listen to, but it was a video on YouTube. And I generally use YouTube for music. I'm not generally a person who watches a lot of YouTube commentators. And this wasn't a commentator. This was a doctor, British guy named Peter Fenwick, and he was talking about a subject. And when I say it, you're going to think I'm veering off into the category of the weird, but I promise I'm not. He was talking about near-death experiences. And generally, when near-death experiences are brought up, you generally get two reactions, and they're both kind of on the extreme side of the fence. You either get those that are of the hardline materialist that say that, the brain requires a chemical process, that thoughts themselves require a biological process, and that therefore, beyond the functioning brain, nothing could exist. That, in other words, these are just mere byproducts of the imagination. And then you have the absolute believers that actually think there's something to them. And Fenwick is neither one of those. He was interesting to listen to in the fact that he was pretty much forthcoming about what was conjecture and what was not. In fact, he even touched on the topic. We don't know if a brain can exist. I mean, if consciousness can exist without the brain. And even clarified the term near-death experience being just that, near death. You're not actually dead. He even went on further to say we don't know, the scientific community doesn't even know that when you're dying and you really do actually cross over into death, if your dying process is like what happens when people have near-death experiences, and that we don't know too much about what happens, except in the cases that he'd studied thousands of them, about what happens to people when, in those types of moments. And he went in a little bit of detail. I don't want to veer off topic from what I want to talk about here, but he did make some interesting note that people, cross-culturally speaking, they see exactly kind of what they've been taught, that it even varied in the United States alone by regions of the United States, depending on religious belief and stuff, what people saw. He mentioned in certain Asian cultures that a lot of people saw a river, and they thought they had to pay somebody to actually get across the river, which I didn't know that was actually. I don't know a lot about Eastern culture, but I didn't know that was a part of the belief system. I actually thought that was part of the mythology of paying the boatman to get across. I don't want to get off track here. The interesting thing that he made a note of in terms of death itself, he got to talking about death and culture, and he was talking about how in society, in developed society, before you had antibiotics and before you had pretty sound medical procedures or medical advances, before you had vaccines, before you had medications, even, something that seems trivial today like dentistry, which, if you've ever had to visit dentists, or if you've ever had any problems with your teeth, you know how serious that could be. And it could be deadly in a time period when you didn't have the medical knowledge that they have today. And he was talking about how, say, culturally speaking, he used the Victorians as an example, and that's what led me to the idea of making this video. And I know you're thinking, what the fuck is he going to be talking about with this? But he was saying that the Victorians themselves actually had a healthy respect for death, as death was on a personal level with them. Now, some people could argue that we're almost desensitized to death in the modern civilized world because, you don't have to. You can simply turn on a TV. I think even the most sheltered people in today's world, would know just from what little bit you see on the news how violent it can actually be out there. But on a personal level, he was talking about the healthy respect that they would have had for it, or at least the comfortable nature they would have experienced with it. For instance, and I know it's a little bit creepy when you Google it, but there are what they call post-mortem pictures that a long time ago, you didn't get your picture taken maybe once in your lifetime. And, when someone died, sometimes they would, sit him in a living room chair and the family would gather around him and they'd have a photograph, or they took post-mortem pictures of people, after their death in very living-like positions. Some of that has been disputed, or at least challenged, I could say. It's never been debunked or disputed, like, as though it never took place. We have physical proof of it. Just like we have physical proof of what they called invisible mothers, which is another creepy thing from the Victorian era where, in order to get a baby to sit still for a picture, the mother would put a blanket over or a curtain or something like that, and it looks kind of like a curtain holding a kid. Must have been some serious trauma, is all I could think of in regards to, but it wouldn't have been traumatic back then. It would have been very normal as what I'm doing here with this video is today. And I do know, and then I'm going to kind of get into what I wanted to address here. Both of my grandparents were born in the late 1900s or the early 1920s. I know my grandfather on my mother's side was born in 1915. And he did live to be very old. And, being young at the time when I knew him, I was too stupid to really ask the kind of curious questions I would have been asking today. I'd have been all over, being a fan of history like that, I would have been all over what he might have seen and done. But we did have that discussion. He had a sister and a brother who both died when they were like 10 years old. He talked about diphtheria, whooping cough, or the various number of things that, pretty much, could end someone's life at a given moment at the time. How kids he went to school with, half of them, it wasn't uncommon to lose 2 or 3 classmates when you were 10 years old, And the one thing that he got me, and this is where the brainstorm bit kind of came in, and what little sense this is going to make, is that I happen to think that at the same time, and it was something else that I happened to think about my grandfather, because it was a discussion we once had, sexuality-wise at the time of the Victorian era or the early 1900s, it was very repressive. It was very puritanical. It was kind of I remember my grandmother even told me that, when she first started hitting puberty back in the early 1930s, that when she had asked her mother about it, her mother had told her, well, nice people don't discuss those things. Nice people don't talk about those things. It was very much swept under the rug. Just like and he was pointing out, Fenwick was in his video, I'll post a link to it at the bottom here when I get done, if you're interested in it. But he was pointing out how in our own world today that we don't necessarily, because we don't have a personal experience with death very often, the way they would have had on the level back then, where you would have, already known several people your own age that would have died by the time you got to, adolescence, that death is hushed, that death is swept under the rug, that we don't have really a healthy relationship with death today. Now, you can argue that either kind of way you want to, or you can dispute that. But it wasn't that was getting to me. It was the fact that sex was very much a taboo, death was not. And I was thinking about how in religious cults like AA, for example, death is not really a taboo thing because you see it all the time. Anybody who goes to AA longer than, I'm going to say in my first year in AA, there were plenty of people that I would be sitting beside in an AA meeting that would commit suicide or drink themselves to death or drug overdose. And I remember at the time thinking that the reaction among the people in AA, and I don't even think the Victorians would have been heartless about death. I think they would have been familiar with it, but I don't think they would have been heartless. But I remember the heartless way, the callous way that death was approached in AA. They would say something like, by the grace of God, as I mentioned before. They would say some have to die so that others can live. Or in situations like my own personal experience, when they thought I was going to die of an alcoholic overdose, they almost seemed exuberant about it. They couldn't wait for me to hurry up and die so they could have something to talk about in those meetings. When old-timers died, they would turn it into a big ugly meeting fest where they would say things like, back in AA, when we weren't nice and when we got to mistreat people more openly, which is kind of comical since it's, an abusive organization anyway. But, they would always turn it into, so-and-so died and he was mean. And he talked to the newcomers like shit, and he told those people to go out and drink themselves to death and die. I noticed that with religious cults in general, now I'm not an expert on all religious cults naturally, because I haven't had time to study them all, and really, frankly, the subject of cults don't necessarily interest me that much. It's not something that's a particular passion of mine, so I'm talking firsthand from AA experience. AA itself has an insensitive, callous attitude towards death, but at the same time, underneath their messages, they have an almost puritanical, repressive attitude about sex. In other words, the way they approach sex in the meetings is not what I would consider, and I'm not going to say moral, because I don't want people to think I'm some kind of moral Puritan of some sort that believes, that sexuality should be handcuffed or hindered or not as openly discussed as it is, but I've noticed mature, I guess you would say, there's not a mature attitude about sex in there. The part in a big book where they mentioned now about sex, whenever someone would read that topic in a meeting, everyone would snicker like they were 11 years old and they were hearing, a dirty word for the very first time. And everybody would brag about, it's got to be bullshit, how they had the lives of rock stars. But the way it was talked about, sexuality, the way it was explored, the way it was covered in topics, it was not healthy. In my viewpoint, I'm just going to say it was very repressive. It was almost puritanical. It was considered, sex was talked about like it was dirty, like it was something you should be ashamed of, like it was something that, you shouldn't actually feel sexual urges because, there was something inherently bad in that. Yet they had a very dismissive attitude about death. That's the part of that video that got me to thinking about it, and I thought it was a topic worth exploring. Because I noticed, and I'm not going to go into detail with organizational names and everything, but I noticed, like, I grew up in a very Catholic neighborhood, in a very Catholic dominant family, and sexuality was treated the same way. Sexuality was something to be disgusted by. It was something to be turned off by. It was not something. It was kind of considered in a very immature way, is the best way I can describe it. If you looked at certain pictures and were, aroused by that, you were supposed to feel like you had done something really bad. I mean, it was on par with something unspeakable. If you admired a woman, or if you, whatever, or if you were sexually attracted to a classmate or something like that, it was treated like it was a very nasty thing, like it was a very dirty thing, like it was something that had to be repressed. Like even fantasizing about somebody, for instance, would put you into, it was something you had to go to confession about growing up in the Catholic Church. And yet I've noticed, and again, correlation does not imply causation. That's a fallacy I'm very aware of, so I'm at risk of committing it here. I'm going to say that this is not factually proven, what I'm about to say. At all. This is purely a conjecture and an opinion on my part. But it seems like the more sexually repressed or the more puritanical an attitude of, say, a religious cult like AA is towards sex, it seems to breed, how would I put this? It seems to bring out the absolute worst in people. And I'm not talking about sex as it's a bad thing. I don't think anything's wrong with two consenting adults wanting to do what they want to do. I don't think there's anything wrong with anything to do with sexuality. In fact, sexuality, that would be one topic I'm very, very, very liberalistic about. And I think part of that is because I had such a repressed, guilt-induced childhood with the Catholic Church as regard to it. I got older, and somewhere along the way I realized, something, I should not feel ashamed because I'm attracted to a girl and I want to kiss her, if we're on a date together or something like that. But I've noticed, and I think you'd have to be blind, again, not to notice how often that seems to occur in fanaticism. And I'm not saying that, there are religious people who have ideas about morality that wouldn't be the same as mine. It might be the exact opposite to mine. But I've noticed when it comes to actual fanaticism, it seems to be a bit of a different story. It seems to breed So I'm using, I just realized I'm using the word breed and sex in the same sentence. So it's Freudian slip possibly, but it seems to create an atmosphere where I guess it would be better for me to use examples. I oftentimes bring up Ted Haggart as an example. He was very, very, very anti gay people. He hated homosexuality. He hated people who did drugs. He just preached almost an open warfare on people who had, who were gay or who ever did drugs. And yet, when he was caught, when they finally caught him in an illegal act, he was with an underage young man, and there was drugs present. There was meth present. He was giving young boys methamphetamines, and he was doing things with them. So, in other words, he wasn't even having, he wasn't having even a normal gay relationship, like other ordinary gay people have. He was having kind of a twisted one. And in AA, it's the same kind of way. I've noticed, they have this puritanical type of idea about sex. And I know this is the point usually when when some AA defender comes in and says, only God can judge our sex conduct. It says that in the big book. Well, yeah, it does say that in the big book, but it says a lot of other things, doesn't it? In the 12 and 12, for example, somewhere there in step 6 or step 7 in the 12 and 12, Bill W. talks about how our Creator wants us to live free of all desire. Well, my own particular idea of spirituality is not about living without desire, okay? And there's no human being I know of, with the exception of people who go live in caves somewhere in some remote part of the world and have no human contact, that have ever successfully done that. But, the thing here to me is this: why would you want to do that? Because my own idea of trying to not have any desire fulfilled in this world is just, I don't know. I mean, and I'm not just talking about sexually. He goes on and on in the 12 and 12 about gluttony or about a desire to succeed is warped. It's almost like he's got this puritanical idea that you're supposed to live like some chaste person in a monastery. But yet you turn around and you look at his life, and what did he do? He constantly cheated around on his wife. He even left some of his estate to a mistress. So here's this moral preaching and this really high-minded horse shit that you're brainwashing people with. And yet you're not practicing any of it, I mean, you could point out what went on, what has been exposed that went on in the Catholic Church. I never saw that or experienced anything that I would have thought was like that. I mean, I grew up, like I said, around the Catholic Church. We were at Mass every Sunday. I was an altar boy, even, believe it or not, harder as it is to imagine. I never saw those abuses, but those abuses did take place. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about it that the church was complicit in those abuses and covered those abuses. But this has also happened there was a recent article I was reading about. If I could find a link, maybe I would put it on here to back it up. There was a recent thing with Southern Baptists that had covered up sex abuse. I know there was a case of a guy that I was reading about in the newspaper who was like a youth minister and a youth pastor, and he did something with a teenage girl that was underage, and he was just simply transferred to another parish, and the whole thing was buried. And when the girl come forward, I was a little bit disgusted to see how many people were saying, well, it's been years ago, he was young then. And that was his actually excuse. He didn't actually own up to what he did when he was on the news about it, and he gave a statement. He said he was young, and he was he was in a fragile place and all. And nothing's ever anybody's fault in these religious fanatics that preach an open hatred towards anybody that doesn't adhere to their draconian ideas about morality. But when they're caught in the act of something like that, all of a sudden it's not their fault. Same thing in AA. I noticed that if a newcomer was attracted to someone, or even if you just struck up a conversation, I've given the example before. I was actually striking up a conversation with a woman because she worked at the same company I worked at. I wanted to actually find out what was going on in regards to all of our plants closing down all over the country, and was it going to affect us, and what had she heard? But they assumed I was trying to, just do something like it was reprehensible, even though we were both, grown people talking, but the old timers have no problem taking advantage of a girl who's just gotten out of treatment. And sometimes old timers, it runs with both sexes. I know men who have been 13 stepped in AA just as much as women. These same old timers don't have a problem with that. They don't have a problem with taking advantage of someone who's vulnerable. They don't have a problem of taking advantage of someone who needs a place to stay. And, they buy drugs for them and they keep them screwed up and they do things to them. Maybe by the legal standards of definition, that's not rape, but in my book, it is. Because, when you take... it's a shaky legal term. I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole nother debate, and that would be a whole nother video. That's not really the point I want to make with this. But what is funny is when these old timers, when you point out, like I pointed out a guy who used to deal Xanaxes to young girls that had just gotten out of treatment, and he would move them in, and he would do what he wanted to with them until they ended up back on their drugs or back on the streets. And he showed zero remorse about that. When I pointed that out, they wanted to tell me, who are you to judge? Only God can judge us, our sex conduct. But me, having a casual conversation with a lady that didn't even have nothing to do with something sexual, I was perverse and I was twisted and there was something wrong with me and I had an agenda and there was something bad the matter with me that I would even want to talk to an attractive girl unless I had ulterior motives of some sort. The double standard that it seems to create when you have a naturally sexually repressive society, it's just something, it's a trend that I've noticed. Now, I don't have any studies scientifically wise to back that up outside of a few cases like what I just pointed out. You have churches that really do have a really stringent hardline approach about sexuality. Now, I realize, you have people out there who are, religious, who don't necessarily believe, let's say, in premarital sex or something like that wait till they get married, etc. I'm not lumping everybody in who's religious as being some kind of closet, predator, but I'm just noticing that structured organizations that seem to have a major problem with what you do in the bedroom, they seem to create an atmosphere of predatory behavior of some sort. Kind of like, even though Victorian society was very, let's say, repressive about sexuality, at the same time, these things did go on. It's kind of like, and I realize I'm taking up too much time here and I'm going to wrap it up. And I hope I made sense in any of this. I probably did not, because it was just a topic that got on my head and I just thought I'd throw it out there and see if anybody, what they think, agree or disagree with it. But there, not too long ago, there's an older person that works in management at my job that was talking about, back when films were clean. And me, I'm an actual film fanatic of obscure films and films that nobody's ever seen. And it always gets me that a lot of people have this image, of 1930s and 1940s movies as being very clean and very moralistic, I guess you could say, and stuff like that. That exists, yeah, but... the first thing I think of when they bring that up, I think of I think it was 1947. It was called The Seventh Victim. It was directed by Val Lewton. It's really a great film if you ever look it up. But the main character is obvious, is suicidal. She's lesbian. There's devil worship. There's murder. And it has a very, very bleak and depressive ending. I think of something like the original 1932 Island of Dr. Moreau, played brilliantly by Charles Lawton. I mean, there's a scene at the end where he's dismembered. And it hints at evolution and it hints at all kinds of twisted things within the topics themselves. In fact, there was pre-code films with brilliant actors like Bela Lugosi and or Boris Karloff that had all kinds of messages in there that when you ever watch those films, if you ever come across any of them, you would say, "Wow, this actually made it to the screen." In the 1930s and 40s, these kind of sensitive, taboo subjects were actually touched upon. There's an old 1930s film considered the worst film ever made by some. I've seen actually worse, but it was called Maniac in the 1930s. And there's there's nudity and there's rape and there's hints at all kind of animal cruelty and everything else involved in it. So no situation, even if it would be the Victorian time period or or even religious cults, is as clear cut as people think. But it was just an interesting thing that I've thought about. That it seems like underneath the layer of any repression or the layer of any fanaticism like what exists in AA when it comes to a literally unhealthy subject with sex, that it seems to be an atmosphere where all kinds of predatory behavior seem to be apparent, and they seem to run rampant. And I don't think anybody could argue with me successfully that predatory behavior in of itself is something that's not inherently a bad thing. I mean, that's the reason why, even though there's a shaky ground on what constitutes, rape and things like that, and I think even society itself has never really been too comfortable with the idea of the abuse of power of one person taking advantage of another. That's not to say it didn't go on. That's not to say that for a long time people may have remained silent on some issues like that. I'm not saying that either, but I'm just saying that I don't think, by and large, there's anybody that would argue that preying on people that are vulnerable is somehow not harmful. That there's not something inherently bad in that altogether. To take advantage of someone who's not in their full mental facilities. It was like one time when I was really intoxicated and unable to defend myself, when some people thought it was really funny to really push me around and, really treat me like dirt because they knew I was too out of it to defend myself. I don't think you could argue on any grounds that that's okay. Or at least if you could, I'd like for you to challenge me with that, because I'd have a good time arguing with you about that and fighting back with you about that. But anyway, that's all I got for this episode. I've talked too long, and I hope I made some sense about it. But until next week and next time.